we tend to want to move quickly and solve people's problems faster. And sometimes you're better off with an unhappy person having a bad customer service help desk experience than having a breach. So sometimes you got to adhere to the process, even if it doesn't put a smile on somebody's face. Something I've always said as a CISO is, if you're doing the right thing, I've got your back, no matter what. I don't care if the CEO calls and can't find his Apple Watch for MFA, I got your back. If you take him through the process, I got your back, right? Because I think a lot of these attacks tend to come down to, I don't want to get in trouble if I don't do what I'm told, right? And I think they need to know that somebody has got their back to follow the process, right? And ensure that we implement the security as it's supposed to be implemented.
Welcome to the Information Week Podcast. I'm Senior Editor Jean-Pierre Ruth, your host. In today's episode, we are taking a look at safeguarding your ecosystem from external inputs. These days, CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, have to juggle the orchestration of external inputs into their ecosystems. So how do you make sure that partners or others that are offering external inputs or reaching out with external inputs don't reach where they should not? Especially when they may have AI in their back pockets along the way. For today's conversation, we are joined by Tony Garcia, who is a Chief Information Officer and CISO for Infineo.
Yeah, thanks.
And we're also joined by Ghaleb El Masri, North American Managing Director for Adaptovate. Ghaleb, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, Tony, let's start off with you. Where does it make sense for when you have a partner company, to integrate into your ecosystem, where does it make sense to allow them in? What functions are you allowing them to be intertwined with, and how do you kind of set that up?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. This is a challenge I think most organizations have had and have struggled with at one point or another. I can recall many years ago, working for a large Fortune 100, I would have consulting teams show up on Monday morning unannounced and need access to some SharePoint server, right? And no proper access reviews or access requests or IDs or anything provisioned ahead of time, right? So this is always a challenge. I will say the thing that has really kind of made this not necessarily easier, but I think a little more feasible for most teams is good zero trust methodology and implementation, right? Where you can really determine what resource should be allowed access by what identity, as opposed to the old school methodology of letting them into the network, so to speak, right? And really determining what they should be able to talk to. And I think there's a lot of products out there, ZTNA, et cetera, that do that. Now, what drives that access, obviously, is the business requirements, sometimes state requirements. California versus Maine may have a different requirement as far as how employers or contractors or consultants are treated legally. But typically, once you have that sorted out, then determining what they have access to, usually zero trust methodology is a better way about going about these things to keep that pinhole access as limited as possible.
So they can't just show up with a very sturdy clipboard and just kind of feel like,
No, the dudes are showing up with your laptop, grabbing a cube and plugging it in. Hopefully you're over. So we shouldn't be doing that anymore.
I would certainly hope not. Okay. With that, there have been some various examples of bad actors who've been, using what have been seemingly benign resources to kind of backdoor their way into sensitive areas. Now we've got AI potentially further complicating, such prospects as, that can reach out and potentially start learning things. So how extensively do you go about, say, auditing, third-party presences in your ecosystem? Is it impossible to completely lock things down, lock them out once they have a toe in the door?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge obviously always with that is when you're dealing with AI, it tends to be the speed of which a bad actor can kind of perform reconnaissance, et cetera, on an environment, right? So I think we're getting a lot better, I think, in protocols, whether it's next-gen firewalls or other security constructs architecturally of kind of limiting the access to things. But I think that is certainly a threat that we're seeing now is somebody comes into the door with an asset, and they may have a different AI agent or bot or service running on that platform that the business is accustomed to. And I think building proper boundaries around that obviously becomes critical. The ironic other side of that is smarter, better AI agents. They're also looking at those kind of pings on the network and what someone may be scanning across the network and what they may be accessing or responding to. I've built agents within my security operations center, SOC, that does very much kind of that same similar thing where you can see interesting traffic and start to tease out that traffic pattern and very quickly put together a map and a profile of what that is so you can act quicker.
I think building on Tony's comment, if you don't mind me jumping in and just listening to Tony's points, complementing that from a process or organizational lens, what we found is that the initial vetting to be more than a strict procurement exercise. We find usually bringing a variety of different functions around that and understanding the objective from a business lens, and then what that means from a technology ingress, egress, access rights perspective, really helpful. And also then the communication with the technology and IT teams that this kind of service request or this kind of approval to give them access is for this overall purpose, because they'd have a much better understanding technically than what might be going on, and to be able to support that as well.
Staying on that AI theme, taking it further, obviously, again, the bad actors who have done things like entirely faking personas, including as new hires that we've seen in some instances, even to impersonate existing executives. So what kind of rigor do you have, or have you considered putting in place to kind of better screen for that kind of, potential infiltration through normal means of your organization into your ecosystem, but it's driven by AI?
Absolutely. Would you like me to take that one, or was that for?
Well, actually, that's for Tony. If you could,
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I think one of the challenges we have in security that I always try to remind people is process doesn't ever age, right? Technology tends to change, but processes kind of stay the same, right? And I think this is one of the challenges, to Ghaleb's point. Good process will rarely fail you. If you go back and look at an action movie from the 70s or 80s, where they're firing off missiles from a submarine, you'll see very sound security processes. Nowadays, we've just got a cell phone that facilitates the same thing, right? So I think good processes are always our friend in this. When we look at AI facilitated, say, phishing attacks and those type of things, I think having those good processes does help circumvent that. A lot of that, whether it's a good callback path, I require a lot of my users to provide either a personal email address or a personal cell phone number. And, if somebody says, hey, I'm in an urgent situation, I'm in Starbucks, I need a password reset, and I'll just have my team say, can I call you back on your cell phone in just a minute, right? It's like sometimes that will short circuit an attack. And I think a lot of organizations, we tend to want to move quickly and solve people's problems faster. And sometimes you're better off with an unhappy person having a bad customer service help desk experience than having a breach. So sometimes you got to adhere to the process, even if it doesn't put a smile on somebody's face. Something I've always said as a CISO is, if you're doing the right thing, I've got your back, no matter what. I don't care if the CEO calls and can't find his Apple Watch for MFA, I got your back. If you take him through the process, I got your back, right? Because I think a lot of these attacks tend to come down to, I don't want to get in trouble if I don't do what I'm told, right? And I think they need to know that somebody has got their back to follow the process, right? And ensure that we implement the security as it's supposed to be implemented.
Ghaleb, you have some thoughts you wanted to share on that?
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think the challenge has been, and what we've tried to do in our organization, is how do we get a culture of awareness and a culture of compliance closer to the front lines? So across our consulting team, across our different offices globally. And Tony's point about the callback, that's one of the most effective means we found around some of the phishing emails and the other types of urgent requests that come in. We're not so large an organization also that we can't have anyone being able to call a senior leader, and they all have our numbers too to verify things, particularly if it's around a financial request as well. So like Tony's point, trying to reassure them that we've got your back, reach out to us. Better to measure twice and cut once than perhaps make a mistake.
Okay, so let's get into the considerations when looking at startups and innovative companies that are leveraging AI these days, particularly. Ghaleb, if you could lead us on this. Looking at these kind of companies, they're aiming to bring promised efficiencies to their partners when they're offering their services. How much leeway, given what we've already said, how much leeway do you feel they really should have in your ecosystem, where it actually leads to them actually delivering on real benefits to your company? And how do you kind of communicate to the IT teams, there's a reason why these, this third party needs this layer of access or permutation into your ecosystem?
Yeah, completely. I think, we're a little circumspect at first in the sense that leeway is earned in time and with further understanding. So we try to do our due diligence in making the initial decisions to onboard. But largely, we're thinking about an ROI framework that's adjusted by risk. So what's the business benefit? What's it going to bring us? But then if you think of the denominator, what's not only the TCO, but what's sort of the inherent risk or the built-in risks that could also affect that denominator, that total cost, and the return that we get. And things that help us reduce that risk factor would be things like audit rights, things like opt-outs around training data and what we would be giving them there, and simply just trying to understand really with maybe 5 whys or more, why are you using the data in this way? Why do you need it? Why is it going into this or that? And sometimes, unfortunately, we found certain vendors who couldn't quite explain it to our satisfaction as well. And in those cases, we didn't use them. And then in other cases, we did. And for us, then maybe as a separate topic, unless you'd like me to expand on it, think more about then the organizational use case with the tech teams and with our other teams as well, and then how to use a system that we're looking to trial. And from that perspective, communicating what it's about and why it's being used. And then at least having 2 tiers of usage for us as an organization, because we have sensitive client data that we would have. And therefore, there are certain things we cannot and would not use that. And we want to make sure our consulting teams are aware of that. And there also isn't a shadow AI need as well beyond it. And then also for the sanitized data, where it wouldn't be client data, there could be additional privileges, but also clear on what you can and can't use it for, and the procedural safeguards around that as well.
Taking that a bit further, how do you measure the overall benefits of bringing that third party into your ecosystem? What kind of ROI do you believe really warrants their presence? Where do you say, okay, this is proven that this really needs to be here?
2 things I think have been the key things we've looked at so far. So can we get to a greater than 50% efficiency around certain tasks of our consulting teams? There's a lot of type of tasks that vary depending on client and use. But if you think of writing up a proposal, an initial discussion document, an RFP, what kind of efficiencies can we get around some of the more labor-intensive efforts? And we've seen some benefits around a 50% gain in time saved on a consultant per capita basis. The other ROI metric we're looking at is greater quality or accuracy around some of the information we can research and gather and then be able to present. And there we're looking at less errors, less mistakes, and faster time to finish the task.
And how do you ensure, Tony, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, to add to that, to what Ghaleb was saying, I think that's kind of spot on. I think one of the problems people have with vendor and third-party management is we tend to look at this as a point in contact, right? Security on day one sees what permissions they need and access they need. The business defines requirements for the deliverable. And the reality is it's much more helpful to look at that as a life cycle, right? You're looking at what access do they need over time as part of the project. You may have people coming and going. It may be heavy at the beginning. It may be less at the middle or the end. Same thing with deliverables, right? It's managing those requirements as a life cycle and always touching base with the vendors and having that communication flow. I think with a lot of third-party risk management, we've pivoted way too much to a one-and-done approach of show me a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001, and then I'll let you run around the building and do whatever you want, right? And that's probably a very flawed approach for obvious reasons, right? So I think we are getting a lot better at managing that risk as a life cycle. And I think that's what he spoke to.
So how do you overall ensure that your company's leadership, and not just security, is guiding what a third party in the ecosystem is doing and offers to the organization? A partner can make promises about what they'll bring to the table, but how do you make sure that what that is what leadership wants versus the third party saying, "Oh, we're going to do this for you and it'll be great," and the leadership is like, "But that's not actually what we need in our organization." Thanks for the fridge. I wanted a car. So
that never happens.
Maybe on that one, I have a bit more of a unique response, given the nature of our organization. So Adaptovate largely started in helping organizations as a transformation consultancy, and largely in applying new ways of working to drive change through large complex organization, primarily through agile ways of working and agility. So we really believe in iterative approaches and test and learn from the leadership level and across the entire organization. So we'll usually try to think of the right governance in a new engagement and a new onboarding of a vendor, and whether that's bi-weekly, we typically like that, corresponding with your usual sprint time frame, though that can differ. And we'll sort of treat it as an internal sprint. We'd prefer the vendor work in that way. And then what are the milestones every 2 weeks where we can show and tell what the progress is and how we're going, to ensure that the vendor, but also the internal project team looking to implement this new technology internally, is getting the feedback directly from what the leadership was expecting and what the leadership is then seeing at each iteration. So we can keep the loops a lot tighter from that perspective.
Okay. All right, great. All right, well, gentlemen, those were the primary questions for the Q&A portion. Now it is time for my favorite part of the show. The game screen is up for those who are listening along. Now it's time for Questionable Ideas, our tabletop exercise, where our panelists will serve as interim executives at a fictional company called Questionable Ideas. These scenarios were not shared in advance with the panelists, and they may sound exaggerated, but will relate to today's topic. As always, my guests are not responsible for the presence of goblins, gremlins, and kobolds in these scenarios. That is all my fault entirely. Now, for reference sake, the goblins represent the sense of hype and jumping on technology as soon as it's looking new and shiny and popular. The kobolds represent more traditional old school thinking when it comes to dealing with technology. And the gremlins are there for... They see chaos opportunities and they will embrace it with the technology that is presented to you. So for the purposes of this exercise, gentlemen, you will each be essentially in your same type of role, but in service as an interim executive for Questionable Ideas. So whatever powers and thoughts and reactions that you would have with the roles that you currently have, please employ those powers, because I've even had some guests be like, okay, we are going to stop them and cut their salary if they want to do that outrageous exercise, because that sometimes is what you need to do. Okay. All right. Gentlemen, all right. Ghaleb, Tony, are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. Scenario 1. Questionable Ideas wants to focus on building a top secret quantum compute project with resources in-house, but needs to streamline so its teams can focus on this project. The CEO, who's been advised by the goblins, has tapped a startup called JustTrustMeBro.ai to introduce a platform that will assess workflows and identify inefficiencies across the organization. How do you establish guardrails to let this platform deliver real results while also protecting proprietary secrets within your organization?
You want to start, Ghaleb?
Sure. Yeah,
That's a good question.
it is.
Go for it.
I'd start by asking the questions. It seems like a great idea, but where do we want to start? What do we need asked? And then what would be the benefit of that as well? With the idea being that running around unfiltered in the organization to find use cases wherever they may be may not be the most secure approach that we'd like. It also may not get us the exact answers that we need. So can we be a bit more targeted, focused, and take a more need to know or need to use approach? And from that, I'd ask them to really think about the sequencing of what would be needed around that? And then how do they make sure it does follow toll gates or checkpoints to get us to where we need to go?
Tony, any thoughts that you want to add in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think my questions on that, from the jump there on building a quantum computer internally, I think, my thoughts on that would be not all consulting processes, map onto all projects equally, right? So I would be asking, have they ever built anything like that or worked adjacent to a project like that? Coming in and trying to find efficiencies in building a quantum entanglement pair, et cetera, could be radically different from, a digital transformation effort somewhere else, right? So I don't think that they're synonymous or they necessarily overlap to each other, right? And I would be much more concerned if they've undertaken a project of that nature and they have an experience or, any reputation or client. That they could provide is a reference for that type of work moving forward. That would be my initial concern on the front end.
Well, the Goblins have definitely said, hey, just trust me, bro. That's why they chose a company to go.
Exactly. We've done this. We got this. Sure.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. On to scenario 2. The hiring team at Questionable Ideas is struggling to find candidates with the skills needed to support this quantum project. The Kobolds have proposed locking candidates in a dungeon where they must prove their tech skills to escape. HR and the legal department
legal problems
are not too keen on this for obvious reasons. Instead,
security's on board.
Instead, they're deploying AI resources to screen candidates, and they have found some potentially ideal remote candidates who need access to prove their capabilities. The Kobolds believe these potential candidates might actually be AI sock puppets. And they still want to use a dungeon approach for screening candidates. How do you balance the in-house use of AI while also facing a potential external AI that might be trying to spoof and game your system at the same time? Do you let them fight?
Tony, you want to take this first, or should I?
Yeah, I will tell you, and full disclosure, I've held a TSSCI previously. So the second you said top secret, I'm taking anybody offshore off the table. Like, it's too proprietary, too critical to let anybody near that, right? If you're building something with that, once you let somebody offshore touch it, you have no control of that IP. So if this really is top secret, your security and IP is top concern, then it's got to be, local face-to-face candidates, at the very least remote in your national, state, nation, whatever it would be, right? So yeah, that would be the first decision I would say is you can only hire from here, have to go through specific reputable, recruiters, obviously. Have they held a clearance? Do they hold a clearance? Can they get a clearance? A lot of that applies. Now, that being said, you run into the same problem we run into with any government organization. Your candidate pool drastically shrinks once you've made those list of requirements clear, right? But I think that does cover the baseline of what you need to have, I think, to cover the risk for top secret, quantum, et cetera, right? To weeding that out. From there, how you interview them and qualify them, short of probably locking them in a dungeon, I think is up for debate. But I'm not opposed to the dungeon. I've just never seen it.
And I'm still not clear how breaking out of the dungeon would necessarily translate to success on this particular initiative. But I think
they're certainly a hacker if they figure that out. Right? They got hacking skills.
I would say, though, that what we're observing more and more, and what I would strongly suggest to the team, on top of your geofencing point, Tony, and the screening there, is that face-to-face meeting, at least for a set of interviews. Know that they're a real person. They've come in. It would be worth the investment, presumably, with this kind of effort and this kind of nature and the risks at play.
Well, in the Kobold's defense, they were trying to emulate Tony Stark, who built his Iron Man suit in a cave under duress to try and see that the candidates can actually prove that they have the skills that are needed in a very manual and real world way. Okay. All right. Last scenario. The quantum project is making progress, but the development team keeps running into anomalies that they really can't figure out what's going on. One day, an infiltration is discovered that could be the problem source of these anomalies. The security team says that third-party access via the building management system was exploited to access the quantum project somehow. Shutting down access across the board to find all vulnerabilities could be very disruptive to day-to-day operations. And the gremlins are ready to hit the big red button to shut everything down to save the company from their perspective. How do you approach screening such risks while also maintaining operations for the organization?
Yeah. Maybe just jumping in there, then continuing our pattern, Tony. I think of it first in terms of control, then shift. So control first. So who needs to be informed? Who do we need to communicate to? Where's the business continuity body around these kinds of decisions where we have to decide? And then take that decision as per the protocols, and then begin to think about the remediation plan and the actions needed. And that decision could be to shut down, it could be to continue, it could be some combination within where you have more targeted isolations, but it would be in around quick communication and activating that emergency body you have for these procedures.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And in addition to that, I would probably take a NIST CSF kind of approach of kind of isolate that. I think to the point, I'm old enough that I remember the days when you had a security problem, you pulled the cable, pulled the plug. Like we don't typically get afforded that kind of flexibility and that sort of command in the CISO role these days. It's kind of frowned upon by the business. So I think certainly you would have to look at what are the high risk vendors that you can maybe remove from the pool, remove from access while maintaining critical business access, and start to work through that, right? Lock down what you can I say conveniently, but without too much inconvenience while you kind of work through the security problems. Typically in those scenarios, you got a pretty good idea who's motivated to do things and who isn't, and who might be the problem, who isn't. So yeah, I would kind of start with that outer circle and kind of bring in that ring, as Ghaleb said, and start to sort through where you think the real problem is until you zero in on where the real issue is.
Well, the gremlins think that the real problem is that they were not given the chance to use the big red button to solve everything by shutting everything down and forcing everybody to start from scratch.
The red button is it's a good fallback.
Right. All right. Well, listen, Ghaleb, Tony, that's the time we have for today. I really appreciate you making yourselves available and coming onto the show for us.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. It was fun.